Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 64th deck and it's titled General Umori, the Ally Collector. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So, as always, before we get into the actual deck tech itself, I do want to very quickly highlight some ways that you can support this channel if that is something you are interested in doing. You can always follow us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ. You can find us on Reddit, u/POYNZ13. You can send us an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. All of those are great ways to get in contact with us, and I'm more than happy to talk to everybody about whatever you really want to talk about, whether it's magic related or not. I'm always happy to chat. And then if you are looking to actually support this channel a little bit more directly, you can always head on over to our TCG Player affiliate link that is in the description of this video. Any cards you purchase once you've clicked on that link lets them know that we sent you over there, and we get a little bit of kickback, so that's a great way to help us out. And then, of course, if you would like to support us even more directly, you can go over to our Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and you can support us at various levels. Right now, all of the money that we are getting from that is going toward trying to record in-person games, trying to buy the equipment for that and kind of get the setup going, so that way we can provide more games. And then, of course, there's also benefits that you get for joining the Patreon. You might get access to the deck lists a week early. You get access to a Discord channel where you can talk about some of the decks that we're actually building. You can get in on some of the games if you would like to play in any of the games for this channel. And if you support us at the highest level, we will give you access to the full unedited videos so you can see the gameplay and hear the players actually talking about what's going on and participating in that. And then we'll also send you a random card of the week for that month whenever you sign up at that level. So to our current Patreons, or I suppose patron might be the right word, William Swiftfoot and Doodle Humper, thank you very much for all of your support. We do appreciate that. And of course, if none of those are your style, you can just like this video, subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. Trying to, of course, grow the community. So any help you can give there would be greatly appreciated. And so, without any further ado, I say it's time to jump into our actual deck tech for this week and talk about our random card. Now, it's been a little while since we've done an actual random card, not a suggested card, but our random card for this week is Harabaz Druid. And Harabaz Druid is 1 and a green for a 0/1 human druid ally that taps to add X mana of any one color to your mana pool, where X is the number of allies you control. Now, this kind of gives us a very straightforward way of thinking about this deck, and you may already be able to guess where we're going, especially based on the title of the deck. But let's take a look at our commander and kind of get some more ideas. So this week, our commander is General Tazri, and she is 4 and a white for a 3/4 human ally. When General Tazri enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an ally creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library, and you can pay 5 mana, one of every color. Ally creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of colors among those creatures. So, as you may be able to tell, we are an ally tribal deck. We are 5 colors as well, so we're playing every ally we possibly can. And our goal is to make sure that we have a ton of allies on board, so when we have Harabaz Druid, we're able to get a ton of mana. However, there is a little bit of a tweak to this deck. Not only are we ally tribal, we also have a companion in Umori the Collector. And Umori the Collector is 2 and a hybrid black-green for a legendary creature ooze. It's a 4/5. And its companion clause, so it can be our companion if each non-land card in your starting deck shares a card type. Then, as Umori the Collector enters the battlefield, choose a card type, and spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. Now, you may notice that it specifically says each non-land card shares a card type. In Commander, That does include our commander. So the fact that General Tazri is a creature means that Umori can only be our companion if we only play creatures and lands. And that is exactly what we are doing. We have no non-creature spells in this deck. We have 38 lands, and the rest are all creatures. Now, I didn't go super in-depth and make every single creature an ally. We gotta have some friends to the allies, some allies to the allies, if you will. But we do have all creatures. And that does give us some interesting deck building restrictions, and I'm a big fan of it. I think this deck was a ton of fun. So let's actually talk about what we're doing here. And let's start with some themes for this deck, make sure that we're all on the same page. First up, as we've already mentioned, and we're going to keep mentioning it because it is the most integral part of this deck, we are ally tribal. So we have a ton of creatures that are allies, and also a ton of creatures that care about allies. So, for example, here, we have Ondu Cleric, which is 1 and a white for a core cleric ally. It's a 1/1. Whenever Ondu Cleric or another ally enters the battlefield under your control, you may gain life equal to the number of allies you control. So if we just have Ondu Cleric, we cast it, we play it, comes in, we have 1 ally now, so we gain 1 life. However, if this is our 10th ally, so we have 9 other allies on the field, we cast this, we gain 10 life. And then that keeps happening. So every single time we play an ally, we're gaining a life. And there are a ton of allies that actually do this same thing. Not necessarily the life gain, but that give us some sort of benefit whenever an ally enters play. And some of them give us that benefit based on the number of allies we control, which is incredibly powerful. So our goal is to kind of just throw out as many allies as possible, get a ton of life, or get a ton of cards, or get a ton of triggers, whatever it may be, and just slowly kind of grind out the victory in the game. So that is theme number 1. For theme number 2, we had to be a little bit creative with this deck. Because we have the Umori restriction and we can only play creatures, that limits some of the stuff that we can do. So our second theme is ramp, but because we don't have things like cultivate, we don't have mana rocks, we can't play instants and sorceries and artifacts and enchantments, we needed to find a way to do the things that every normal commander deck wants to do, but while only playing creatures. So Fabro Elder, for example, is a great way to ramp, and that is 1 green-white for a 0/0 Treefolk Druid. It's got vigilance, and it gets +1/+1 for each color among permanents you control. So when it comes in, we have green and white, so it's automatically a 2/2. And then it also can tap, and for each color among permanents we control, we get to add 1 mana of that color. So if it comes in, it's a green and a white, it automatically starts tapping for 2 mana. If we have an ally for every single color, this becomes a 5/5 that taps for 5 mana. So Fabro Elder is a great example of being able to ramp and being able to cast some of our spells in the future. But just like I mentioned earlier, because this is an Umori deck, we needed to find ways to do this on creatures. That means that we're ramping with creatures, we're finding removal on creatures, we're drawing cards with creatures, and a lot of them do tend to be allies. Fabro Elder, not an ally. It is, of course, an ally to the allies, but still a great way to kind of showcase the fact that we're using our creatures to generate mana, generate card advantage, and things like that. And so, finally, that brings us to the last theme of the deck, and this one I'm a big fan of because this is very much a playstyle that I enjoy. We are blinking our permanents. Because a lot of our permanents, like Ondu Cleric for example, care about entering the battlefield, we wanted to find ways to make that happen multiple times. So Yarok the Desecrated, for example, is 2 black, green, blue for a legendary creature elemental horror. It's a 3/5 with death touch and lifelink. And if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So if we have Yarok on board and we cast Ondu Cleric and it's our only ally, it comes in, we gain 1 life, but because of Yarok, we actually do that again. So we gain 1 life twice. And now that doesn't seem super powerful, right? We're just gaining 2 life. Who really cares? But if we go back to the earlier scenario of having 10 allies, we're not gaining 10 life, we're gaining 20 life. And that's half of our starting life total. Yarok allows us to really benefit from any enter the battlefield effects, and it triggers whenever any permanent enters play. So if our Ondu Cleric enters play, it gains life. If another ally enters play and triggers Ondu Cleric, we still double up on that trigger. And so, obviously, to go along with Yarok, we do have some bounce effects, some blink effects, some cards that exile our creatures and then return them to play under our control, so that way we can try to get the triggers multiple times in one turn rather than just a one-off effect. So that is our main game plan with this deck. We want to play as many allies as possible, get as much mana as possible, as much value as possible, and then double up on all of our triggers, blinking our creatures, having them enter the battlefield again, and hopefully we'll be able to kind of grind out a victory, maybe without attacking, but also once we have a ton of allies, we can pretty much just kind of swing through whatever boards our opponents are creating. So that's our plan, and that's how we're trying to win. And with that out of the way, that does lead us into our key cards section of this deck tech. Some cards that are really what we want to be doing with this deck. These are our top cards, our main synergy cards, and the cards that help us win pretty much more than anything else. So first up, we have Kazul Warlord. And Kazul Warlord is 4 and a red for a 3/3 Minotaur Warrior ally. When Kazul Warlord or another ally enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each ally creature you control. So, like I just mentioned, sometimes we just build a whole board full of allies and start attacking our opponents, and if we're able to put +1/+1 counters on every single ally we control, whenever an ally enters the battlefield, we can have a massive board very, very quickly, especially if we have something like Yarok, if we've been blinking our permanents. This can get out of hand very quickly. So ideally, our opponents won't really be able to stop it, because even just Kazul Warlord entering play means that he becomes a 4/4, anything else gets a +1/+1, and if we have a way to give haste, there is a world where we just play Kazul Warlord, play a bunch of other allies, and then just swing kind of out of nowhere. And Kazul Warlord is one of the best ways to pump up our team because it is permanent. We have other allies that give +1/+1 to the entire team. We even have one that gives +2/+2 to the entire team. But Kazul Warlord specifically gives counters, and that is incredibly valuable because we want to make sure that we can put the counters on our creatures, and then even if we don't attack this turn, we keep that power boost. So Kazul Warlord definitely earns a slot as a key card in this deck. And moving on to our second key card, we have Munda Ambush Leader. So I mentioned earlier that we tried to include a bunch of ramp and card draw and card advantage cards into this deck in creature form, and Munda is a great example of that. So Munda is 2 red, white for a 3/4 core ally with haste, and it also has Rally, which means that whenever Munda or another ally enters the battlefield under our control, we may look at the top 4 cards of our library, and if we do, we reveal any number of ally cards from among them, then put those cards on top of our library in any order, and the rest on the bottom. So, we are looking to play Munda, play Kazul Warlord, play an Ondu Cleric, look at the top 4 cards of our library, and decide if we want any of those cards. Now, unfortunately, we can't keep things that are not allies, so we couldn't keep lands, we couldn't keep things like Yarok or friends to the allies. We have to only keep allies. But that means that if we're looking for a specific ally, every time an ally comes into play under our control, we can look at the top 4. If it's not there, we can throw them all on the bottom. So we are able to churn through our deck at an alarming rate if we have Munda in play, because we're able to decide what exactly we're drawing at what exact point. And that becomes incredibly powerful, especially when you consider that Munda is a Boros card. We're getting our card advantage here from red and from white, not from blue or from green, which normally might be the case. So Munda is incredibly powerful, especially when we're trying to go wide. And when I first built this deck, honestly, I didn't think Munda was going to be super powerful. And then I played a couple of games and I got him out there a couple of times and I was like, blown away by how powerful Munda really is. So I wasn't expecting much, but Munda has very much won me over and earned a spot in our key cards as one of the more powerful cards in this deck. And finally, we have our last key card of the deck, and this one might be a little more obvious. This one is Brago, King Eternal, 2 white-blue for a legendary creature, Spirit Noble, 2/4, flying. Whenever Brago deals combat damage to a player, exile any number of target non-land permanents we control, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. Now, yeah, this is a bit of a non-bow with Kazul Warlord because we would lose all the counters that we had gotten, but the way that this works out is all of our allies enter the battlefield at the exact same time, which means that all of our allies trigger every other ally on board, and they count every other ally on board. So this is incredibly powerful, and in some cases, even game-winningly powerful. Because, for example, if we go back to the Ondu Cleric and Kazul Warlord, if we have both of those creatures, and we have 10 creatures total, both of them see all 10 creatures see them, so Ondu Cleric isn't gaining 1 life, and then 2 life, and then 3 life. Ondu Cleric sees every single ally enter at the exact same time and gains 10 life for each ally that comes in. So if we have 10, we just gained 10 instances of 10 life, gaining 100 life right there. And then Kazul Warlord is the same thing. Every single ally sees every other ally enter the battlefield, so we are getting 10 +1/+1 counters on all 10 of our allies, not just 1 per each. So Brago is a great way to really get a burst card draw, or a burst boost of power, or a burst boost of life, or even damage in some cases. And Brago is incredibly, incredibly powerful when we want all of our things to be having enter the battlefield effects. And if we can partner Brago up with a board full of allies plus something like Yarok, that's just game winning. I don't know what our opponents do at that point. And yeah, that might be like, the magical Christmas land of really wishing we can go above and beyond. But hey, it sounds super sweet, and I'm a big fan of Brago. I think it's incredibly powerful in general, and I think it's incredibly powerful in this deck especially. So those are our key cards for the deck. And the next piece of this is to take a look at some cool interactions, some cards that work incredibly well together. And I do want to be honest, going into the cool interactions, I really struggled to find some this week because a lot of our cards work together. A lot of our cards are allies that care about other allies. So it was very difficult to pick out 2 specific cards and say, yes, these 2 are almost like partners. They work super, super well together. So it is important to remember that a lot of the cards in this deck work together, and there's a ton of cool interactions that I can't include because, they're all allies. They all synergize super well together. But to give you an example of what I'm talking about, let's take a look at our first cool interaction. And this week, we have Drana, Liberator of Malakir, and Resolute Blademaster. So Drana, 1 black for a legendary creature vampire ally, 2/3, flying, first strike. Whenever Drana, Liberator of Malakir, deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control. You'll notice Drana does not actually care about allies. Drana has nothing on it that cares about allies, but she is an ally herself, and she's an incredibly powerful one at that. So if we partner Drana up with Resolute Blademaster, and Resolute Blademaster is 3 red-white for a 2/2 human soldier ally. It's got Rally. Whenever Resolute Blademaster or another ally enters the battlefield under your control, creatures you control gain double strike until end of turn. Now, normally, the way that Drana would work is she would swing in, she'd hit, and then put a counter on all of your other stuff that would then hit after the first strike damage. But with Resolute Blademaster, if we give everything double strike, Drana plus the rest of our team hits for first strike. Drana then puts a counter on everything. Then everything hits for double strike, and Drana puts counters on everything again because it specifically triggers on combat damage. So if we hit with double strike, we are getting double the triggers. And if we can put basically 2 +1/+1 counters on our entire team every single time we attack, plus we're attacking with double strike, that is a very, very quick combat win because our opponents aren't going to be able to keep up with that, at least ideally, because our stuff is going to get so big so quickly, and because of the double strike, anything that blocks it just dies to first strike damage. So an incredibly powerful way to start swinging early, especially because we can play Drana turn 3, turn 4, curve into Resolute Blade Master, and just start pumping our team very, very quickly. Now, our second cool interaction is a little bit different, and I try not to do this very often, but I am including our card of the week. Normally, I try not to because I want to showcase as many cards as possible, but I couldn't pass up this interaction. So, first up, we have our card of the week, Harabaz Druid, 1 and a green, human druid ally, 0/1, taps for mana equal to the number of allies we control. And our other card that we want to partner this up with is Mirror Entity, which is 2 and a white for a shapeshifter changeling. That means that it is technically an ally. It's a 1/1, but we can pay X mana, and until end of turn, creatures you control have base power and toughness XX and gain all creature types. So, 1, that turns all of our non-allies into allies, which is great. But what it does is it pumps up our entire team. Most allies tend to be on the small side. We don't have a ton of big ones. They tend to be 1/1s and 2/2s and 3/3s. And it's hard to win through combat damage if that's what you have. But if we have 10 allies, I'm going to keep using 10, it's a nice round number, and we tap Harabaz Druid for 10 mana, we can sink that mana into Mirror Entity, making all of our board 10/10 creatures. And yeah, Harabaz Druid couldn't attack, but the other 9 creatures could. That's 90 damage with creatures attacking right there. And that's not counting that maybe we have first strike, maybe we have double strike, maybe we have flying. Who knows what we could possibly have, but if we get a massive board of creatures and we can drop Mirror Entity and Harabaz Druid, then all of a sudden our board of tiny little creatures that have a ton of keywords are now massive creatures with a ton of keywords. So Harabaz Druid and Mirror Entity are very powerful, and honestly, they're both all-stars in this deck on their own. Harabaz Druid makes more mana than pretty much anything else, and Mirror Entity is a great way to pump up the team. So separately, phenomenal, but together, that is where they really shine, because they're able to produce so much mana and just sink it into Mirror Entity, and really it's like a build-your-own Craterhoof behemoth. We just kind of swing through the table and win. Or at least that's the goal. So we'll see how that actually works in practice. But before we get to that, we do have one last, or I suppose 2 last bits of the deck tech to talk about. Since this is a budget show, we of course have to talk about the budget. And this week, our total deck price came in at $78.27, which is not super expensive, but it's also not super cheap. And a lot of that price is coming from 2 cards in particular, one of which we've already talked about, which is Yarok, who's $11, but he's actually not the most expensive card in the deck. The most expensive card in the deck is Thassa Deep Dwelling, which is currently $12.85. So Thassa, 3 and a blue for a legendary enchantment creature god, 6/5, indestructible. As long as your devotion to blue is less than 5, Thassa isn't a creature. And at the beginning of your end step, exile up to 1 other target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. So this is a blink effect every single turn. We're able to keep triggering our enter the battlefield effects and be able to keep rebuying our allies, which is incredibly powerful and really helps us win the game in more ways than you would expect. However, Thassa is a massive $12, almost $13. And if we combine Thassa and Yarok, they combined make up almost $24 of this deck, which means they're making up almost a third of the deck price on their own. So if you are looking to trim down on the cost of this deck, I would highly recommend cutting out Thassa and Yarok, because you can put this deck down to almost $50, which is about half of our budget. And there are a bunch of allies that I did not include in this deck that would, of course, be very powerful in here. So if you're concerned about budget, that would be my suggestion. However, if you're not concerned about the budget, or you just happen to have these cards laying around, then of course they are very powerful and they do help accelerate the game plan quite a bit. And on the other hand, if you're still looking for more cards to add to the deck that might have been out of the price, I've got you there too. This week we only have one out-of-budget upgrade because most allies tend to be pretty cheap, and the fact that we're playing only creatures limits the cards that we can put in. So I could say, yeah, like Mirari's Wake would be very powerful. It doubles your mana, gives all your creatures +1/+1, but it's not a creature. We can't actually play that in the deck, so I can't suggest it for the out-of-budget upgrades. So instead, I'm going to recommend Morophon the Boundless. And Morophon is a 7-mana 6/6 shapeshifter. It has changeling, so it is an ally. And as Morophon the Boundless enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. No spoilers here, it's going to be allies. And spells of the chosen type you cast cost 1 mana of each color less to cast. This effect reduces only the amount of colored mana you pay. And other creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. So Morophon is incredibly powerful because it allows us to reduce the cost of all of our spells, and allies can be a little bit expensive. Most of them aren't going to be reduced by too much, maybe 1 or 2 mana, but it's still enough to be relevant, and it gives all of our allies +1/+1, which doesn't sound like much, but again, if we're getting +1/+1 counters, we're getting flying, menace, double strike, whatever, that adds up. So Morophon would be my suggested card to include. It is a massive $18.32, so it is way out of our budget for this one. However, if you are looking to swap it out, it was very difficult for me to decide what card to swap out because everything really does something. But in the end, I settled on Drana's Emissary, which is 1 white-black for a 2/2 Vampire Cleric ally. So, yeah, we're cutting an ally, but we would be putting in an ally with Morophon. And Drana's Emissary has flying, and at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. That's not an overly powerful effect in Commander, especially because Drana's Emissary doesn't care about other creatures in play. We don't have other ally synergies with it, like it doesn't see other allies enter the battlefield. And the way that Commander works is it's usually 9-10 turns, so even if we get Drana's Emissary out on turn 3, we're only going to be looking at gaining 6 to 7 life and draining for 6 to 7 life over the course of the game, which is good. That is not a bad effect, but it's very unlikely that it's going to matter in the grand scheme of things. So I don't think Drana's Emissary does quite as much work as I was hoping it would when I first put it in here. So if you're looking to swap out something for Morophon, that would be my recommendation. However, if you are looking to keep Drana's Emissary in the deck, I don't think that's a bad choice. It is a 2/2 flyer, which is also very useful. It's an ally, it does gain life, it makes your opponents lose life. So Drana's Emissary, not the best ally we've got, but it is still an ally, and in some cases, that's really all you need. So that is our only out-of-budget suggestion for this week. And the last piece of this is to move on to some gameplay. We're going to see how this deck performs in not just one game this week, but 2 games this week. And our first game this week, I had a 4th player lined up, but unfortunately they couldn't make it, so we do only have 2 opponents. There's only 3 people in the game. And so for the first game, we are joined by Jason, playing Sakashima of 1,000 Faces and Tana the Bloodsower, and Shawn, who is playing Marchesa the Black Rose. So Jason's Sakashima and Tana deck is all about creating tokens and copying tokens, and he really wants to use Sakashima to copy things and then use Tana to make the tokens. And so I've never seen this partner pairing before. I've never seen this particular build that Jason has, so I'm very excited to see how it works, and I think it's going to be a ton of fun to play against because tokens and copying things is a very powerful ability and very powerful style of playing, but it's also a very fun way of playing as well. And then next up we have Shawn playing his Marchesa the Black Rose deck. And this Marchesa deck is a little bit different than what you might expect because this is actually a treasure deck. He wants to make a ton of treasures, get some enter the battlefield effects, maybe kill off his creatures, but bring them back with Marchesa. And so what that's going to do for us, of course, is mean that hopefully we're not going to get out-ramped very early on because of the treasures. And really the difficult part is going to be combat, because if we can't attack Marchesa because the creatures just die and come back and nothing happens, maybe they kill our creatures, things can get very difficult. So I am worried about the Marchesa deck, But I also very much like Marchesa, so I am interested to see what Shawn does with this deck. And so this is going to be our first game. Don't worry, we'll have one more after this. But I hope you all enjoy the game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Jason goes first, followed by Shawn, and then myself. On Jason's first turn, he plays a Terramorphic Expanse, sacrificing it to search his library for an island and put it into play tapped. Shawn plays a Morphic Pool, I play a Forest and cast a Llanowar Elves. Jason plays a Game Trail tapped. Shawn plays a Shivan Reef and casts Talisman of Indulgence. I play Unclaimed Territory, naming allies so that it taps for mana of any color, but only for ally creatures. And then I cast a Hada Freeblade, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever it or another ally enters under my control. I then attack Shawn for 1 and pass. Jason plays a Training Center and casts Chasm Skulker, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever he draws a card, and it creates X 1/1 squid tokens with Island Walk when it dies, where X is the number of counters it had. Shawn plays a Mountain and casts Zorn, allowing him to make an additional treasure token whenever he would make one or more treasures. I play a Savage Lands and cast Core Blade Whirl, giving all my allies first strike whenever it or another ally enters. This also triggers the Freeblade, putting a +1/+1 counter on it. And I then move to combat, attacking Jason for 1 and Shawn for 2. When Jason draws for his turn, he puts a +1/+1 counter on Chasm Skulker, plays an island, and then casts his commander Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, having it come in as a copy of Chasm Skulker. Shawn plays an Underground River and casts his commander Marchesa the Black Rose, giving all his creatures Dethrone and allowing him to return a creature to play if it dies under his control with a +1/+1 counter on it. He then attacks me with the Zorn, triggering Dethrone, putting a +1/+1 counter on the Zorn, and hitting me for 4. I play an island and cast Yarok the Desecrated, doubling any abilities that trigger from my permanents entering the battlefield. When Jason draws for his turn, he puts a +1/+1 counter on both of his Chasm Skulkers, and then casts Helm of the Host and plays a Rootbound Crag tapped. Shawn plays a Haunted Ridge, and then casts Swiftfoot Boots, immediately equipping them to Marchesa, giving her haste and hexproof. He moves to combat, attacking Jason with both of his creatures, triggering Dethrone and putting a +1/+1 counter on each of them. Then Jason takes a total of 9 damage. I play a Seaside Citadel and cast Resolute Blade Master, which gives all my allies double strike whenever it or another ally enters under my control. But in response, Shawn casts Bedevil to destroy Yarok, preventing me from doubling my triggers. Then the Blade Master resolves and I give my team double strike and put an additional +1/+1 counter on the Freeblade. I then move to combat, attacking Jason for a total of 6 and Shawn for 4. When Jason draws for his turn, he puts a +1/+1 counter on both of his Chasm Skulkers, plays a Mountain, and then casts a Tendershoot Dryad, making a 1/1 Saproling on each upkeep, and giving Saprolings +2/+2 if he has the City's Blessing, which he currently does not. However, in Shawn's upkeep, Jason makes a Saproling and immediately gets the City's Blessing, giving all his Saprolings +2/+2. Shawn then plays a Rogue's Passage, and casts Storm the Vault, giving him a treasure token whenever he deals combat damage to a player. He moves to combat, attacking me with both of his creatures, triggering Dethrone, putting a +1/+1 counter on each of them, hitting me for 11 total damage and making 2 treasure tokens. I play a Swamp and cast my commander, General Tazri, searching my library for an ally and putting it to my hand, choosing Seascape Aerialist. And this also gives my team double strike and puts another counter on the Freeblade. I then move to combat, attacking Shawn for a total of 10 with my allies, and in my second main phase, I cast an Avacyn's Pilgrim. In Jason's upkeep, he makes a third Saproling token, then puts counters on his Chasm Skulkers when he draws for turn. He equips Helm of the Host to Tendershoot Dryad and moves to combat. This makes him a token copy of the Tendershoot Dryad, letting him make more Saprolings and give them an additional +2/+2. This allows him to attack me for 15 total damage with only 2 Saprolings and Sakashima. In Shawn's upkeep, Jason makes 2 more Saprolings, and Shawn immediately moves to combat, attacking me for 6, and before I can block, he activates Rogue's Passage, making the Zorn unblockable. This ends with me taking 6 while Shawn makes 2 treasure tokens. Then in his second main phase, he casts a Blasphemous Act, doing 13 damage to each creature, wiping away the board, but leaving behind 5 squids on Jason's board thanks to the Chasm Skulkers, while Shawn returns both of his creatures to play in his end step thanks to Marchesa. Also in his end step, Storm the Vault transforms into Vault of Catlacan, which can tap for blue mana equal to the number of artifacts Shawn controls. On my turn, I cast a Hagra Diabolist, which makes target opponent lose a life for each ally I control whenever it or another ally enters play. This time I have Shawn lose 1 life. Jason casts a Curiosity Crafter, gaining no maximum hand size and allowing him to draw a card when he deals combat damage with a creature token. He attacks me for 5 with his unblockable squids, drawing 5 cards and knocking me out of the game. Then, in his second main phase, he plays a Command Tower and casts Swiftfoot Boots, equipping them to Curiosity Crafter, giving it Hexproof and Haste. On Shawn's turn, he equips Marchesa with the Swiftfoot Boots, giving her Hexproof and Haste, and then activates Rogue's Passage, making Zorn unblockable. After that, he casts Nicol Bolas Dragon God, and activates Nicol Bolas's +1 ability to draw a card and force Jason to exile a card from his hand or a permanent he controls. Jason chooses to exile Temple of Abandon from his hand. Shawn then moves to combat, attacking Jason with both of his creatures, triggering Dethrone and putting a +1/+1 counter on each of them, hitting him for 8 total damage. On Jason's turn, he immediately attacks Nicol Bolas for 3 in the air, +2 on the ground, and also attacks Shawn for 3 with his squids, but they're not unblockable since Shawn doesn't control any islands. Before damage, Shawn casts Terminate to destroy one of the squids attacking Nicol Bolas, saving his Planeswalker, while Jason draws 3. In his second main phase, he casts Korra the Boundless Sky, and before Jason can move to his end step, Shawn casts Costly Plunder, sacrificing Zorn to draw 2 cards, returning Zorn to play with Marchesa's ability. On Shawn's turn, he activates Nicol Bolas's +1 ability to draw a card and make Jason exile a card, which winds up being a mountain from his hand. Shawn then casts a Sphinx of the Second Sun, giving him an extra beginning phase before his end step. After that, he casts a Vorpal Sword and moves to combat, attacking Jason for 4 with Marchesa. At the end of turn, Jason casts Cackling Counterpart to create a token copy of Korra, and at this point, one of the Korras should have died to the Legend rule, but we don't catch that at the time. Unfortunately, we also forget that Shawn should have had another beginning phase, so he misses out on an upkeep, draw, and untap phase. On Jason's turn, he casts Echoing Equation, turning all of his creatures into non-legendary copies of Korra, and this allows him to attack Shawn for 28 damage in the air, winning Jason the game. Alright, so that was a pretty sweet game, but it's just the first one, so we're not going to quite get into the wrap-up just yet. We're going to move on to our second game, and this one we do have 4 players, and we are joined by, again, Shawn, once again, for Brago, King Eternal. We also have Bilal playing Evelyn the Covetous, and we have Lena playing Dina Soul Steeper. So Shawn's Brago deck is a blink deck, very similar to what we mentioned earlier with our own Brago in this deck. He wants to blink a ton of his permanents, exile them, return them to play, and get value from it. So he's playing a bunch of permanents that draw cards, that generate mana, that do things like that, so he can keep churning through his deck and keep getting value well beyond what his opponents can get. And I've played against Shawn's Brago deck in the past. It is very powerful, so I'll be perfectly honest, I am very worried about the Brago deck, but hopefully our allies can keep up with that. So we'll see how it goes. Next up, we have Bilal's Evelyn the Covetous deck, which is a vampire tribal deck in the Grixis colors, which I am very excited for because that is a super unique color combination for vampires. Typically, they're in Mardu, not Grixis. So I look forward to seeing what he's got in store, and I'm very interested to see how blue affects the vampire tribe. So we'll see how that one goes as well. And then finally, we have Lena and her Dina deck. We have seen Lena's Dina deck before, quite a few times actually. It's a very powerful deck, and it's mostly the Willow Dusk pre-constructed deck, but she has made quite a bit of tweaking to it, so you'll see a lot of the pre-con cards, but you'll also see some other very powerful cards. So I am worried about Dina. I've actually played Dina on this channel before, and I know how strong she can be when the engine gets going, so I think that is a concern, but I will say I think out of all three of these, I'm most worried about Brago just because of the amount of value that can really generate. But who knows what's going to happen. So I am very excited for this game, especially to see how Evelyn works because I haven't seen Evelyn before. So I'm excited. I hope you all are as well, and we'll see how it goes, and I will talk to you all once it is done. At the start of the game, Shawn goes first, followed by Bilal, myself, and then Lena. On Shawn's first turn, he plays a Plains. Bilal plays a Waterfront District. I play a Frontier Bivouac. Lena plays a Jungle Hollow, gaining a life. Shawn plays an Island and casts Prophetic Prism, drawing a card when it enters. Bilal plays a Dragon Skull Summit tapped, and casts Viscera Seer, allowing him to sacrifice a creature to scry 1. I play a Mystic Monastery. Lena plays a Forest and casts her commander Dina Soul Steeper, which makes each opponent lose a life whenever Lena gains a life. Shawn plays a Plains. Bilal then sacrifices Viscera Seer to itself, scrying 1 and trying to find a third land, and then Shawn casts a Mana Geode, also scrying 1. Bilal casts an Izzet Signet, but couldn't find a third land. I play a Mountain and cast Wood Elves, searching my library for a forest and putting it into play. Lena plays a Tainted Wood and casts Willow Dusk Essence Seer. She then moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 1 with Dina. Shawn plays an Island and casts his commander Brago King Eternal, allowing him to exile any number of non-land permanents he controls when he deals combat damage, returning them to play afterward. Bilal plays a Sunken Hollow and casts Dimir Signet, followed up by casting Arcane Signet. I play a Plains and cast Feyburrow Elder, which taps for mana equal to the colors among permanents I control, and then I cast Akum Battlesinger, which has haste and gives all my creatures +1/+0 whenever it or another ally enters the battlefield, and this allows me to move to combat, attacking Bilal for 2. Lena plays a Forest and attacks Bilal for 1 with Dina. Shawn plays a Plains and casts Muldrifter, drawing 2 cards. He then moves to combat, attacking Lena for 2 with Brago, exiling Muldrifter, Mana Geode, Brago, and Prophetic Prism when he does damage, returning them to play. This results in him scrying 1 and drawing 3 cards. On Bilal's turn, he casts Maestro's Charm, looking at the top 5 cards of his library, putting 1 to his hand and the others to his graveyard. Once that resolves, he casts Expressive Iteration, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, putting 1 into his hand, 1 on the bottom of his deck, and exiling 1, being able to play it this turn. This results in him exiling Rakdos Charm, but being unable to cast it. I cast my commander General Tazri, which allows me to search my library for an ally card, put it into my hand. This lets me put the card of the week, Harabaz Druid, into my hand, and then I move to combat, attacking Bilal for 3. Then, in my second main phase, I cast the Harabaz Druid, which taps for mana of 1 color equal to the number of allies I control. Lena plays a forest and casts Tivash Gloom Summoner, which allows her to pay X life at the end of her turn to make an XX demon token, where X is the amount of life she's gained this turn. Shawn plays an island and casts Elite Guard Mage, gaining 3 life and drawing a card when it enters. He then attacks me for 4 in the air, triggering Brago when they hit, targeting his entire board and resulting in Shawn gaining 3 life, scrying 1 and drawing 4 cards as his permanents re-enter the battlefield. Then, in his second main phase, he casts a Whirler Rogue, creating 2 1/1 Thopter tokens. Bilal casts Strafan Morer Progenitor, creating a blood token in his end step for each player who lost life on his turn, and then being able to sacrifice 2 blood tokens to put a vampire into play, tapped and attacking. He then casts Silent Blood to draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, triggering Stefan, making a blood token. He then plays a Thriving Bluff, naming blue so that it taps for both blue and red. I cast an Ondu Cleric, gaining a life for each ally I control whenever it or another ally enters play, this time gaining me 4 life and also giving my team +1/+0. I then cast Munda Ambush Leader, letting me look at the top 4 cards of my library and reveal any number of allies, putting them back on top in any order, while putting the rest to the bottom whenever he or another ally enters the battlefield. This gains me 5 life, gives my team +1/+0, and allows me to reveal Talus Paladin, putting it on top. I then cast Irregular Cohort, making a 2/2 Shapeshifter token when it enters. Both of them trigger my allies, giving my team +2/+0, gaining me 13 life, and letting me look at the top 4 cards of my library twice, eventually leaving Talus Paladin, Core Entanglers, Seagate Loremaster, and Masked Vandal on top. I then cast Realm Walker, letting me look at the top card of my library at any time, and cast allies from the top of my library. This also triggers my other allies, gaining me 8 life, giving my team +1/+0, and letting me look at the top 4 cards of my deck, leaving the same 4 on top. After that, I move to combat, attacking Shawn for a total of 15 damage, and he blocks with his Thopters, killing the Battle Singer and the Thopters. On Lena's turn, she plays a Swamp and casts Ezarut Channeler, making all her creatures cost 1 less for each life she's gained this turn, and it can also tap to gain 2 life. Shawn plays a Plains and casts Strionic Resonator, allowing him to pay 2 mana to copy a triggered ability he controls, and notably, this would allow him to go infinite and draw his entire deck with Brago if he had 2 mana rocks. Luckily for the rest of the table, he only has 1. He then moves to combat, attacking me for 6 in the air, triggering Brago to exile all his permanents when he deals damage. This also allows him to copy the ability with Strionic Resonator, doubling up on his Enter the Battlefield abilities. Once Brago's abilities resolve, he ends up gaining 6 life, making 4 Thopters, scrying 1 twice, and drawing a total of 8 cards. Then in his second main phase, he casts Sky Diamond and Azorius Signet. Bilal plays a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1, casts a Rakdos Signet, and then sacrifices his blood token, discarding a card and drawing a card. On my turn, I cast Seagate Loremaster, allowing me to tap it to draw cards equal to the number of allies I control. This triggers the rest of my board, gaining me 8 life, letting me look at the top 4 cards of my library, putting them all to the bottom. And then I cast an Agadim Occultist, which can tap to put a creature from an opponent's graveyard into play under my control if it costs less than the number of allies I control. This triggers my allies, gaining me 9 life and letting me look at the top 4 cards of my library, putting them all to the bottom. Once that resolves, Bilal casts a Dig Through Time, looking at the top 7 cards of his library and putting 2 into his hand. I then cast a Core Blade Whirl, giving my team first strike whenever it or another ally enters under my control. This triggers the rest of my board, gaining me 10 life and letting me look at the top 4 cards once again, putting them all to the bottom. After that, I cast Mina and Den Wildborn, allowing me to play an extra land each turn, gaining me 11 life and letting me look at the top 4 cards of my library, putting them all to the bottom once again. Lena plays a Swamp and casts Leyline Prowler, before activating as a root channeler to gain 2 life, making each opponent lose a life, and making her creatures cost 2 less, which we all agree to apply to the Leyline Prowler as well. She then activates Willow Dusk to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Dina, and then, in Lena's end step, Bilal casts Drown in the Lock to destroy Brago, but Shawn saves his commander with Turn to Mist, exiling him until the next end step, but that means Brago won't come back until Shawn's end step, giving us one more turn before he can go infinite. Still at the end of turn, Lena pays 2 life for Tivash, making a 2/2 demon. On Shawn's turn, he plays an island and casts Sun Titan, returning a plains from his graveyard to play. Then, at the end of his turn, Brago also returns to play. Bilal casts a Deep Analysis, drawing 2 cards, and then immediately flashes back Deep Analysis, drawing 2 more cards. He plays a Choked Estuary and casts Tainted Indulgence, drawing 2 cards and discarding a card. Then, at the end of turn, he makes a blood token with Strafan since he paid life to flash back Deep Analysis. I play an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it to search my library for a swamp and put it into play tapped. I then activate Seagate Loremaster to draw 11 cards. After that, I cast a Hagra Diabolist, which makes target opponent lose life equal to the number of allies I control whenever it or another ally enters the battlefield. This triggers my allies, so my team gains first strike, I gain 12 life, make Shawn lose 12 life, and look at the top 4 cards of my library, putting them all to the bottom. In response to the triggers, Shawn casts Ghostly Flicker to exile Sun Titan and Elite Guard Mage, returning them to play and gaining 3 life, drawing a card and returning an island to play. Then my triggers resolve, and I cast a Resolute Blade Master, giving all my allies double strike whenever an ally enters play. This also gains me 13 life, makes Shawn lose 13 life, and I look at the top 4 cards of my library, putting them all to the bottom. After that, I cast a Kazandu Blade Master, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever an ally enters the battlefield. This also gains me 14 life, makes Shawn lose 14 life, and I look at the top 4 cards of my library, this time revealing Kazul Warlord and putting it on top. After that, I cast a Core Entanglers, but in response, Bilal casts a Whirlwind Denial, countering my ally and any other abilities on the stack. Once that's resolved, I cast the Kazul Warlord from the top of my library, putting a +1/+1 counter on every ally I control whenever an ally enters the battlefield. This also gains me 15 life, lets me look at the top 4 cards of my library, putting them all to the bottom, and makes Shawn lose 15 life, but in response, Shawn casts Angel's Grace to prevent himself from losing the game this turn. Unfortunately though, this still puts him to 0 life since Angel's Grace prevents combat damage, meaning he will lose on Lena's upkeep. I then go to combat, attacking Bilal with everything for a total of 57 damage since my entire board has double strike, knocking him out of the game. Then, in Lena's upkeep, Shawn dies to state-based effects since he's at 0 life, being knocked out of the game. Lena then casts Trudge Garden, allowing her to pay 2 mana whenever she gains life to create a 4/4 Fungus Beast token. She then attacks me for 2 in the air with her demon, but unfortunately that's all that she's able to do, so I'm able to untap and attack her for 57 damage, winning me the game. Alright, so those were some sweet games. I'm very impressed overall with honestly every deck that showed up this week. I think that if we start with the first game, I think Jason's token deck was really powerful and honestly tons of fun. It looked like something I would love to play, and it seemed very up Jason's alley as well. Being able to copy a bunch of tokens and make the tokens bigger and draw cards with the tokens, it just seemed like a sweet value engine, and being able to use Sakashima and Tana together in that way just seems very powerful. So big fan of that deck, and I'm very happy that it won if we couldn't. Shawn's deck for that game as well, also very powerful. I think that we made the mistake of attacking into him multiple times when he was on the throne, so he kept getting +1/+1 counters and was able to use Marchesa to keep recurring his creatures. So maybe in hindsight we should have been just a little bit less aggressive, but at the time I was hoping we could kind of race him and get some double strike, and I was trying to find lifelink, but we couldn't quite get there. So not our game. We really got out aggroed in the first game, but still a very fun game nonetheless. And then in the second game, that really highlighted the strength of our deck because everyone else was kind of doing what they wanted to do. Shawn had an infinite combo on board. He just didn't get the chance to activate it. Bilal was starting to roll with some vampires, but unfortunately he lost a lot in the beginning because he couldn't find his third land for quite a few turns. Even though he had every single signet in his deck, it still wasn't quite enough to get him on par with everybody else. Lena also wound up drawing a ton of lands, so she didn't do quite as much as she wanted. And I think that our deck really got the chance to shine in that second game. It is really due to the fact that nobody drew a board wipe. If someone had wiped away the board, we would have been in a much worse position. That is one of the downsides to playing Umori with all creatures, is we don't have a ton of ways to stop board wipes because there's no instant speed protection, there's no instant speed removal. Everything we're doing is at sorcery speed and has to be put into play, so that is something to keep in mind playing this deck. A board wipe could be absolutely devastating, and so it might be worth trying to find a way to flash in some allies because there are allies that care about indestructibility. But since there wasn't a board wipe, we really just kind of got to steamroll the rest of the table. Being able to in one turn bring Shawn down from almost 50 life to 0 was very impressive, just continuously draining for life and gaining life, and then the double strike. It was very impressive. I'm very happy with this deck. I love tribal based synergies. I love creature based decks and attacking, so this deck really did everything I wanted to do, and it was a lot of fun to build around a companion with a super restrictive cost. Normally there are ones like Zerda sometimes that aren't super difficult to build around, but Umori feels like one you don't see very often because of how restrictive it really is. It's incredibly difficult, especially because you still need a commander. So you either need to have all creatures if your commander is a creature, or all planeswalkers if your commander is a planeswalker. There's really not any in between. So very difficult to try to do, but a lot of fun, and I'm very, very happy with this deck. So if you have any suggestions for any future videos, if there's any cards you would love to see made into a deck, please do let me know in the comments below or send them to me on any of our social media accounts. But I suppose with all of that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you actually like the video as well. Subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.